you have the right to say that too. And we appreciate it either way.
Just focusing mainly on Ben.
Yeah, so this is week 6. This is week 16. It's April the 12th. For the Marxist line. And for those who aren't familiar with this show, this is basically where a weekly roundup of what's going on in the Marxist community.
And happy Easter to all those celebrating that out there. And
oh, that's right, it's Easter.
So, quick start to that.
Yeah.
Big Christian holiday, I think, among both Catholics and Protestants.
Yeah, it is an important holiday, I guess, and like probably I don't know how celebrated it is in Canada, but I guess it's more celebrated in the United States.
It's celebrated here too.
The Protestant churches, it's it's the time of year where the bigwigs raise a ton of money, is through Easter. So that's why Trump was, at one point talking about opening up the country by Easter. That's a favor to his, far-right Christian honcho supporters.
Yeah, it's a major Christian holiday.
Yeah, we don't quite have that here. We're like, yeah. All right, let's get rolling.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So, let's cut right to the chase to Ben's article.
Right on, some bashing right away.
Yeah. So Ben, you wrote this article. It's on. It's a criticism of the RSN. I know the RSN, even though I don't think it claims to be Trotskyist. It's mainly comprised of Trotskyists at the moment, right? And
it appears to be led by Trotskyists. More than that, it appears to be led by the ISO, which apparently, Trotskyists have a
well, the remnants of the ISO.
Yeah.
The ISOs no longer exist. So,
the Trotskyist trend kind of have a reputation for, giving manipulation a bad name. And among these manipulative Trotskyist cults, the ISO had a reputation for being particularly manipulative. However, before continuing, I need to ask an important question. So have both of you read this?
Yeah, and I've been following your post on Facebook about it.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Art.
Yeah. So for those who haven't been following the show, we covered this earlier in the year. I think it was in January or February, and we not only did we cover it, but you released it to the RSN, and then probably shortly after, I noticed that a Trotskyist Discord was sharing it, and so I assume it was being circulated among Trotskyists as kind of poking fun at you for the Stairway to Heaven meme. And
I mean, because it makes me
like,
a
what
boomer.
The fuck is this?
This is boomer politics.
And I know that the disintegration of the Trotskyist cargo cult with the Roche limit and the ISO, that was also circulated, and as well as the this Metcalfe's law. And if I remember right, I think some of the Trotskyists were asking, like, is this even real? Like this Roche limit?
like is it real in physics, you mean? Like
yeah, right. Is this guy really busting out physics on us to to explain why the ISO disintegrated? And so
well, that's really cool.
So,
I did not know it had gotten circulation. And I think the Roche limit graphic in particular deserves circulation. I mean, they may ridicule it, but, my attitude is, so they're saying all these terrible things about me, but what I want to know is, did they spell my name right?
I don't know if they actually
But in this case, I mean, that's an old
reference.
saying. I don't care if they even know who I am, but that's the fact that the graphic got circulated. That's the equivalent of spelling the name right. That gets the idea out there.
So I have a question. Did any of them formally respond to you or informally respond to you, other than
R,
like laughing?
other than R in the preface, who basically said I'm not making any sense.
Right. But is that the only response you pretty much have gotten? Like,
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, you're still waiting for one, right? Like last post I heard you were like, I haven't heard back from you guys. What's going on, sort of thing.
well, that's an answer in and of itself. I mean, that's
Yeah,
called the cricket answer.
yeah.
You can hear the crickets. Basically, I said, hey, I'm really considering joining your group, but I need to know what my rights and responsibilities are. I mean, if my responsibility is to do whatever the fuck I'm told, even if it's stupid and if it's wrong and if it's unprincipled and if it betrays the working class, if I'm required to betray the working class, I'm sorry, that's a problem. And what are my rights? Do I have a right to talk to other members and say, hey, I don't think we should betray the working class? So I asked that, and they said, well, the next step forward is join the email list. Check the points of unity, make sure that's cool with you. So apparently, the guy who answered me wasn't aware that I wrote, this explaining what was missing in their points of unity. So so I said, well, join me up to your email list, and we'll go to the next step. But in the meantime, they'd figured out who I was. And it's
Uh-oh.
like, they didn't know at first. If I was just, Joe factory worker, I think I'd be on their email list by now. But it's just like, whoa, it's not a question of being underqualified. I'm overqualified. I know too much shit. I know how the sausage is made. And these people are all, none of them would want to debate me openly because I'd go through them like a hot knife through butter. So it's like, what are they going to say?
pretty bold claim there.
Yeah,
If anybody's
yeah.
listening,
I think it's on. Somebody from RSN.
Yeah, I mean, I want to treat these people with respect. I
some
don't want to
fighting
call them
words here.
cowards and sniveling dogs, and people who prefer to live under a rock like a worm, because these people, I regard them as people that I treat with respect. So
Okay.
yeah. Anyhow, so
I thought, okay, because I was going to make
Even
a
though
point
that-
there. I didn't know you were going there, but I was going to make a point that they should have somebody there to, if they're going to organize something, that are ready to respond to questions like that. So maybe they are, but then you just went there and said they're afraid to debate you. So, but that's a valid point too, if it's true.
Okay, so so that pretty much, I think that kind of sums up most of what your exchange with them so far, right? Like, is that you sent them some messages about joining, and they replied, "Hey, you got to look at our points of unity," and you said that you have disagreements with the points of unity.
To put
well,
it
can
I
check
don't,
out my
I don't
criticism.
disagree with what they said. My disagreement is with what they don't say,
Okay.
because it's ambiguous. They don't say. They talk about overcoming capitalism, but they don't specify what that is. Well, in the movement, the main alternative to capitalism is socialism, which turns out to be a less bad version of capitalism. So, in other words, they're in favor of an alternative to capitalism, which most people understand as a less bad capitalism. And they say nothing about a commitment to openness and transparency, which is essential. So their unity statement is missing some important things.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Do you think they just maybe haven't had that conversation before?
Say that again.
The things that they didn't mention. Do you think they just haven't had a conversation about those things before?
What do you mean?
Well, you said it's about like what they haven't said, and then in your article it says to give clarity about ending capitalism, which you mentioned. And the second was to add a plank recognizing the need for political transparency. So those two things, do you think they haven't had a conversation regarding those two things yet?
I think that has nothing to do with what's going on. That's like saying,
Okay.
as a used car dealer, has he had a conversation about maybe the need for being honest with your customers? It's like it doesn't make any sense.
Okay. Well, let's move on.
Oh, wait a minute. There's more. Okay.
What
So very
what else?
briefly. So, as far as the unity statement, so the two things that it's missing is an understanding of what it means to get rid of capitalism, which means to have an economy that is not based on commodity production, and the need for transparency. So what those things correspond to is the goal of our movement and the method of getting there. The method is fucking political transparency. We need that in order to have a class-wide movement and a organization that can represent the class. And the goal is an economy that's not based on commodity production. So their unity statement is fine, except for it's missing a clear laying out what the goal of our movement is and how we're going to get there. But other than those two things, there's nothing in it that's really bad. It's just missing what's necessary. It's kind of like the unity statement boils down to we think the world is fucked up and it needs to be better. Well, great. You know, who can disagree with that? Okay. So that's the first point about the unity statement. Now the second point about Metcalfe's law. So, okay, so listen, you guys read it, and I didn't tell you, but there's a test. Do you know what Metcalfe's law is? Without looking, without cheating, what is Metcalfe's law? Anyone want to raise their hand? Andrew, you raised your hand. Okay.
I didn't. That was a twitch.
Anyone.
I'm sitting in the back of the class right now.
Okay, do we have any
scooched down?
Yeah.
What is Metcalfe's law?
Yeah, so I would totally have to cheat on this because
I don't remember.
We talked about this before, but I think you're the only one that's familiar with it.
Okay, you don't know. Neither of you know what Metcalfe's law is.
I can't remember what you said.
But basically, it's saying that networks multiply, right?
Yeah.
So, in other words, if you have a group, okay, and it's got 1,000 people in it, but they're all segregated into these different little tiny groups, and they only communicate within the tiny group instead of all with each other, it's a network of very little power. If you want to get a network of real power, you've got to connect everybody with everybody. Metcalfe's law says you take the number of like telephones in the system. That's the way it's usually explained. It's just like, say there's 1,000 telephones. If each telephone can connect with another 1,000 telephones, there's 1,000,000 possible connections. That's the power of the network. Okay? So if you have a network of 10 telephones and they all connect with each other, 10 times 10 is 100. If there's 1,000 telephones and they're all connected with each other, 1,000 times 1,000 is what? Come on, anybody?
100,000. A million.
I think it's a million.
All right.
A million.
I had to think about your answer for a second, Andrew.
So, it's like if you're going to war and you have an army, would you want an army of 100 people or 1,000,000 people? Which is
100.
All right. But very good.
Spartans,
very good
right?
ones.
Yeah.
They just have to have
Quality,
high morale.
not
That's
quantity,
all.
man.
Okay.
That's
all
right.
So the thing is, Metcalfe's law is going to come up a lot. And, if the coronavirus doesn't kill me, and if I have a chance to, talk with other serious activists, I'm going to have to use it as a club. Basically,
to teach them about Metcalfe's law.
Basically, imagine Metcalfe's law is a hammer, and the sectarians are like beetles, creepy crawly things. So the hammer and the beetle are going to meet, and the beetle may consider it rough and tough, but
we got to move on,
okay.
Ben.
That went. Okay.
Okay. Cosmonaut. So there's a cosmonaut article. It's called "The Practical Policy of Revolutionary Defeatism," and I think it attempts to go into depth on what is revolutionary defeatism, a little bit about its history, and what the author thinks is significant about it. I have a slight gripe about the article. I feel like the paragraphs are could have been broken up a little better. But reading this, I felt like the article's strength is in the first half, and in the second half,
too.
I feel like it gets a lot weaker.
Me too. I was thinking I was thinking that too. Like I really like the start and then their analysis near the end, but I'll explain mine later.
It's important to understand how articles like this are written.
Yeah.
This article was written to explain the second half, but because the second half is so weak, they had to give some context. So they put in the first half, which is good, and that's the part that no one can really object to. And so, that helps give the article more authority. And also, if you're a reader, by the time you get to the weak second half, you've been lulled into one, trusting the author, and two, you're tired mentally. So you're more susceptible to accepting the conclusions. The second half is weaker. So should we jump to that, or should we first cover the strengths of the first half?
Can somebody give a summary for everybody on what exactly the definition of the title is?
Yeah, well, real quickly, what revolutionary defeatism is it's this idea that an imperialist country, or backwards country, I suppose, but there aren't really any feudal countries left in the world, but an imperialist country, a capitalist country, when it's at war with another country, especially one that's weaker than itself, revolutionaries should obviously not support that war, and they should help it to be defeated. Basically, strikes and things that could be basically military sabotage, like having workers not ship arms out to the front lines, that kind of thing. And they should basically help workers to understand that it's more important to have solidarity with workers from other countries. And that's one thing that I think the article kind of lacks, is that important point, is that a lot of what revolutionary defeatism is it's not just you want the bigger country to not bully the smaller countries, but you also want the workers to be conscious that their brothers and sisters are in other countries and that they shouldn't be slaughtering each other. And instead, they need to be turning their guns on the bourgeoisie. And so that important point, I don't think really was hammered home enough. And there's another important point that wasn't really mentioned, despite a lot of mentioning of Lenin. And that was that even though Lenin did acknowledge that workers of, say, bigger countries could be rather backwards, Germany was actually an example in the article. And Lenin did make a reference to the backwardness of Germany, basically supporting wars against other countries and such, because you got to remember, like, World War One, and then, obviously this is before World War Two, but Lenin also held revolutionary leadership to account, and I can't remember if he wrote it in Left Communism or if he wrote it in The Renegade Karl Kautsky, but basically in one of those, he held Karl Kautsky to account, as well as more backwards leaders in the Social Democratic Party of Germany, for basically allowing this backwardness to take hold with the German workers, and he basically saw it as a failure of leadership, that these workers were so backwards and social chauvinistic, and so I think that's an important point that often gets missed when we talk about revolutionary defeatism, and also with like backwards workers in bigger imperialist countries. Did you guys want to add anything to that?
No. Are we going on, or are we going to talk more about the later part of this article?
Yeah, we're going to talk more about the later part.
No, but
so I felt like it got weak right around this point when it started talking about Iran. And when it's talking about Iran here, it's talking about the assassination of General Soleimani, which was fairly recent.
And the possibility of a war between the U.S. and Iran.
Right.
And what the stand should be if there's a war between U.S. and Iran.
Correct.
So basically, there's two things to the background. I'm sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
I'll finish after you. I just wanted to talk about the Vietnam thing for after you guys are done. But I mean, it's not really a weak point. We should
probably talk about that first, because that's important and it's valuable. That's a good example of revolutionary defeatism correctly, which is during the war in Vietnam, the activist groups in the U.S. opposed U.S. imperialism in Vietnam. The Social Democrats and the liberals opposed the war on the grounds that it was weakening U.S. imperialism. But the militant groups basically took the point that the Vietnamese people have every fucking right to stand up for themselves.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go on because I don't know if you guys have ever seen this documentary. I saw it like 15 years ago, and it's really, really good. It's called Why We Fight. Have you heard of it?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, well, I'll post a link to it, and it talks.
Sum it up in one sentence or two.
Okay, it starts off with the Eisenhower's speech of leaving the White House. You've all pretty familiar with
military industrial complex.
Yes, that one, and it goes
in a sentence or two.
So it just highlights the how the military industrial complex works now, and all the media and the power behind the war. And it also says about the difference between, and this goes into like the such importance for an independent working class media is that they learned from the mistakes from Vietnam, is that it was all over the news and they didn't control the narrative, and now that's what happened with the Iran and Iraq war, and that the embedding of journalists is done much more differently than it was now. Anyways, I just wanted to give a mention to that to anybody who doesn't really understand how big of a propaganda machine it is and how carefully crafted the narrative of the war is. It's a really good movie, even though, it kind of like portrays Eisenhower in a, as being this non-imperialist, even though he was an imperialist. There's a lot of good
It
information.
sounds like a big deal.
Kindly grandfather.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is a really good movie. And
I'll just mention something about Vietnam, because this says the anti-war movement in the United States did very little to stop the war. It was the actions of the soldiers in disobeying their officers in Vietnam. But what that leaves out is that the two things are fucking linked. Yeah. It's just like, soldiers in Vietnam were fragging their officers. And I talked to a guy who told me of an incident where, one of these officers, he's there from West Point. He's eager to make his career. And maybe he's not from West Point, but he's telling them to go out to Sector D. And they're saying, we don't want to go out to Sector D. We could fucking get killed. And he says, if you don't go out to Sector D, I'm going to fucking court-martial you. So the next day, this officer is walking, back to his hooch from the shower. And he's got with him like his towel and a slipper on each foot. And when he's halfway between the shower and his hooch, guess what? His hooch blows up. And all of a sudden, everything he owns, except for that except for the towel and his slippers, are hundreds of feet in the air. And hundreds of people in this military group are watching this. And when it blows up, they all simultaneously start clapping and, hooting and hollering and cheering. And the guy I was talking to said, I had nothing to do with the fragging, but I was cheering. And so it sent a message to this guy. It's just like, the next time your hooch blows up, you're going to be in it. And, he decided he's not going to tell these people they have to go out to Sector D. Now, that happened because the anti-war movement in the U.S. was witnessed by these soldiers before going over there.
Yeah.
And this article leaves that out, which is kind of an oversight. But should we go on to the Iran thing?
Yeah, it also heavily affected the morale of the soldiers in Vietnam, and it sapped morale. And a huge part of why one army loses a war against another army actually has to do with morale.
Well, yeah, because you're going to die for a rich man's war rather than for justice and freedom and democracy. That makes all the difference in the world when your life is at stake.
Yeah, and I mean, it can be manufactured quite. I mean, just quickly. I don't know if you remember this, Art, but Ben, I'm sure you do. Remember at the beginning of the first Iran-Iraq war, they told us that there was that statement from that supposed nurse that's saying that Saddam was going into hospitals and killing babies in their incubators.
Yeah, she was the daughter of the ambassador to.
It turned out to be bullshit, and I remember people being so mad around the world and stuff, and it's just crazy how things like that can be manufactured to
but the point is
boost that morale.
We gotta move on. Okay, so we gotta move on.
All right, let me just finish the
sentence. We gotta move on.
Okay. Yeah. When people's lives are on the line, that propaganda turns out to be tissue paper thin. It's flimsy. That's
okay. Well, I'll let's discuss that after the show.
Let's go to Iran.
Yeah. So the article that's pretty much where it starts getting weak is when it talks about Iran and third campism. And right about here, I think it starts to get muddled. Like it just gets. I feel like it gets a little bit more muddled as the article goes down. And basically, they say that that revolutionaries in the United States, and this is where they start to ignore the working class in Iran, the interests of the working class in Iran, and the interests of the working class in the United States. But they basically say that revolutionaries in the United States should oppose the war and they should basically turn a blind eye to the Iranian regime. And that's kind of how I see it.
They don't spell that out, but that's what's in between the lines.
Right. And they basically say that communists in Iran should support the defense of Iran. And yeah, they should support the defense of Iran against the United States, but they also basically say that despite all this brutal shit that the Iranian government's responsible for, especially during the time period of Soleimani, which is pretty surprising because there are these mass rebellions and there's this mass uprising in Iran. I mean, we covered this right in December, and despite that, it says that basically communists in Iran should basically temporarily put that aside and focus on the defense of Iran and not worry too much about the regime. And that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, the formulation they used, and this is a key thing, is is what they call the main enemy. Basically, they use the formulation, and I can't find it now, but I thought I had circled it, that the main enemy of the Iranian people is U.S. imperialism rather than their own ruling class.
Yeah, and it's right. They yeah. In the case of a U.S. invasion, the main enemy for Iranians is not at home. Their main enemy is imperialism. And then the next sentence, it says, communists in Iran are, of course, opposed to the political regime of the Islamic Republic for its brutal suppression of the workers' movements and its political organizations, and its regressive stance on women's rights, and its treatment of national minorities, which, by the way, is basically the LGBT national minority, specifically, as well as some ethnic minorities. But they do not think it fights too vigorously against U.S. imperialism. So, yeah, so there it is, right there.
I found it, yeah.
And that's really where it gets weak. And I'm happy to say that we covered the Mina article around this period of time, which had a much better position on this. And the Mina article is the Middle Eastern Socialists article that various Middle Eastern socialists, and including I think Iranians, helped to put together. And then the second section of this weak part of the article is when it talks about third worldism. And I thought it was right away. I thought it was interesting that it wanted to talk about third worldism without mentioning Mao and his role in
Promoting that.
developing, promoting and creating the three worlds theory.
Yes.
And that kind of showed me that they wanted to talk about it, but they didn't do their homework.
Or maybe they're very well aware of that. They decided to leave it out for their own purposes.
That could be it as well. And so I thought that the third worldist section was rather weak. And it again, it says, it mentions a little bit about workers. Like it says, this makes third worldism, or actually. There's another political strand that downplays the importance of active revolutionary defeatist politics in imperialist countries, third worldism. So in other words, third worldism undermines revolutionary defeatism, and it says it's not the desirability of the proletariat in imperialist countries, the working class in imperialist countries, to carry out revolutionary defeatist policy that is questioned, but its political inclination to do so. All this leaves us with is joystick or sideline politics, the cheering on of great revolutionaries and great revolutionary movements. This makes third worldism a self-fulfilling prophecy, the denial of the ability of the proletariat and imperialist countries to challenge the imperialist bourgeoisie. But there's other problems like, well, like what does it do to international solidarity as well, and how it undermines that. And I think it would have been good to at least give a mention that to Mao's role in developing the three worlds theory and the promotion of three worlds theory or third worldism by Maoists, or maybe give a mention to how, even if it doesn't explain how exactly it permeated into the left, it should at least give a mention that it did. And uh, and also, while wouldn't totally expect them to say this, I think Enver Hoxha actually has something that's, and I don't mention Enver Hoxha very often, but he actually did write something that was pretty interesting on three worlds theory. I think you can probably Google it.
It's probably pronounced closer to Hoja.
Hoja, there you go. So let's move on.
Well, no, I'd like to comment too.
Yeah.
So some of the background of this, and a lot of the stuff we're reading is, so the Bernie Sanders campaign failed. The DSA is in crisis. And the group that put this out, this is Cosmonaut, as well as all the other groups, they're looking at this as a land grab. Think of real estate, and it's up for grabs. It's valuable real estate. The guy who moves first gets it. So these activists are like real estate. They're property. If you can capture an activist, you get to piss on that activist, nobody else.
Ben,
okay.
What does this have to do with the article?
So that's what it's written for, okay? And they admitted on page 4 of the PDF, the section where it shows William Leibniz and August Bebel on trial. So they had one of their people put forth a resolution in the DSA, and it got shot down by the main factions in the DSA. And so they're maneuvering to get people from the DSA. That's why this article appears to have been written. Okay. So it helps to understand. I mean, they're not mentioning Mao for a reason. They want to recruit people from the fucking DSA. And that tells you everything about the motivation and how this article came into existence. And as far as Iran, you know, Art, you summed it up well. It's just like, you know, is the main enemy of the Iranian people at home, or is it U.S. imperialism in the event of a war? Now, in Vietnam, it seems clear to me that the main enemy at the time was U.S. imperialism. Iran, I don't think is the same situation. You have a big imperialism against a little imperialism. So the inclination of this is to support the little imperialism, but they're careful in terms of how they phrase it. You know, we should support the little imperialism against the big imperialism because, you know, it's produced a smaller pile of bodies. So that's kind of in between the lines, although they're careful not to say that. But in any event, the idea...
I'm glad you caught that DSA statement. I think I forgot about that.
Okay. So as far as whether the main enemy of the Iranian people would be the U.S. imperialism or their own ruling class, you know, in a situation like this, you have to actually know concrete details about what's going on and development and things like that, which I don't. But I would strongly suspect, you know, that the main enemy is the one at home for them as well as for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyways.
I know you're skeptical, and that's all right because it's a complicated question.
Well,
so,
I mean
I could be mistaken, and your friends could be correct.
Well, it's not. I agree with a lot of that. It's just we had an Iran article a little while back, and I want to cover that about the economics and stuff like that. I mean, there is a lot of problems with what the U.S. is doing is causing economic problems. But as far as this article goes, I agree with you guys.
So one more thing, which is when there is a war between two imperialist powers, you might say that the working class of each country, they actually have a common interest. But there is a divergence. It's important to understand what it is. The workers in an imperialist country like the United States, we are most helped by the defeat of our own imperialism, okay? And the country that the United States is attacking, the workers of that country are most helped by a defeat of their own ruling class. So there is a divergence of interest. Now, because of the international thing, you take into account the interests of your class brothers and sisters. But as far as the divergence, that's what it is, and it is the opposite of the way it's usually presented.
All right.
So moving on. So The Regrettable Century is a podcast, and they recently had Donald Parkinson on it, who's the editor of Cosmonaut, the magazine we just had an article on. It's a rather long podcast, but it's interesting if you have the time. One thing that's covered with quite a bit of breadth is the idea of having a vision for what to replace capitalism with. And I would say that there's probably more discussion on the the vision from the French Revolution on what an ideal society would be like, and also the vision of like fascist movements like the Nazis, than the vision of revolutionaries and what that should be.
Art, when I followed your link, I ended up at a different podcast by Donald Parkinson and someone else, Marxism Against the Tide of Modern Entity, Uniting the Promethean and Romantic, Part 1.
Oh, I think that was it, isn't it? Yeah, that's it.
Oh. So I listened to half the podcast before turning it off. I listened to it as I was doing something else.
Yeah, and they Parkinson mentions his gripe against luxury communism.
Yes.
Which was that he felt that it was just making capitalism better. And so it was a fairly liberal vision. Did you want to add anything, Ben?
In general, I found a lot of his comments relatively shallow. I did listen as far as his comment on fully automated luxury communism. And it's just like, you could give him the excuse that he's never fucking thought about it and he's ignorant. And so if you keep that in mind, it's not like you condemn him. He's just ignorant and doesn't know any better. No indication he understands the basic idea that the whole point is that the productive forces are huge, but their potential is being restricted by the capitalist mode of production, the rule of the world by capital. And this is what is keeping everybody from having the things they need. Abundance, peace, community. And these things are increasingly possible with the material productive forces. It's just this insane rule by capital that's restricting everything, which is basic Marxism that Donald Parkinson is not familiar with. It's the core of Marxism.
I think a lot of people don't think about that and don't analyze, because I started talking about that same thing with people this weekend, like just giving the example of the cell phone, how there's 1 billion bought each year, and that if we just streamline production and put it into proper processes, how it's being misused, I mean, we could vastly reduce waste and give people the basic technology that they want. That doesn't mean everybody has to have like a, like a 20 like bedroom mansion and shit, but the basic necessities are there for the productive capacities to take care of everybody. And with them we wouldn't have to roll out, a freaking new cell phone every 6 months with a bigger on-off switch. I mean, that's just the basics, just to get into it. But there's a lot that can be, when you apply and think about it correctly on how we can streamline it, if it weren't for the need for, like this constant production, because innovation is expensive too. And that's exactly the reason why they roll it out all the time, is because they got to keep the money rolling to pay for this kind of innovation and to keep the profits going and on and on and on. Anyways, yeah, that's all I've got to say about that.
So should we go to the next article?
Let's move on. So IMT, they have a recruitment campaign. Speaking of recruiting DSAers, and is it burners, right?
I don't think they're being called burners, to my knowledge.
It's not burners?
I don't know. I'm not in that milieu.
Okay, so anyway, the IMT is basically, everybody should be pretty familiar that Bernie Sanders flopped, and or at least is suspended his campaign. It looks like he's totally flopped.
But here. You have an alternative. You can join our cult.
Yeah, and the IMT says they need to train revolutionaries and provide training and teach them how to organize and this and that, and that they're the best equipped to do so because they're in 40 different countries. And so yeah, this is basically a big recruitment campaign by the IMT, with open arms, and I feel like it's it's very opportunistic for the moment,
and it's a fraud. Okay.
Yeah,
here's one of the key sentences. We need to start by building the embryo of a future mass socialist party, as if they have a clue how to do that. And then they add, okay, a wide-ranging network. Note that word, network, of committed revolutionary socialists. But their network is sealed off from other networks, okay? So what they call a network is, the actual phrase is what is called in technology circles a walled garden, okay? It's just like they have activists in their little network, can talk to other activists in their little network, but there's a big wall around everything else that separates them from everything else. So nobody from outside can get into their walled garden. You have to be under their thumb, under their control, to have access to their network. So that's the same thing as all these other groups, including, it's appearing to look like, the Revolutionary Socialist Network. It's just like, yes, it's a network, but it's fucking secret. You can't see it, and we'll only let you in if we think you're stupid enough to, do what we say. Excuse me, not stupid enough to do what we say, ignorant and naive enough to do what we say.
He's got fighting words again. Jeez.
He's got a little bit of Trotsky look going too, doesn't he? This guy.
Let's move on. Left Voice. So there's 3 articles. They're all pretty much cookie cutter, I guess. I mean, but they're all based around Bernie Sanders collapsing, and I don't think that they're really. Left Voice has done a ton of fucking articles on Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
we've covered a lot of this. I would say it's a campaign by Left Voice, right? And what do you so like we pretty much know what these articles are going to say. They're going to say Bernie Sanders is basically a fraud. You guys should join Left Voice, or and then we need a socialist party or a labor party. Um, what do you think about the commitment that Left Voice has made to discussing Bernie Sanders with this many articles, this campaign? We'll call it the Left Voice Bernie campaign.
Well, as far as recruiting from the DSA and from the ranks of disaffected Sandinistas, or whatever you call them, Left Voice of all the trot cults has its shit together the most. Their articles are the most clear. Second Time is Farce, fourth thesis on the defeat of Sanders, lays it out in more systematic form than anything else I've read. I've seen articles that are roughly. Louis Proyect writes good stuff. He actually likes Left Voice quite a bit, which is understandable because it's basically his brand of politics. And Louis Proyect is probably, one of the better writers on the left, just in terms of putting words together that are interesting and that people want to read. But Left Voice is the group that's got its shit together the most. They lay things out in the most, the clearest, the most systematic way, and so their stuff is basically pretty close to the best, if not the best, other than having like a more militant position. Because the problem with Left Voice is at the end, their only solution to this is recruit, recruit, recruit. That's the only problem.
Yeah, with with both of these groups, there's a lot of talk about having a labor party or a socialist party, and then it's it's definitely like a lot of hot air, right? Because there's nothing really being done to build an independent revolutionary party, or to explain what that is, and how it could be built. There's no strategy.
So we need to understand when it's time to talk about an independent party, there's two kinds of independent parties that don't exist yet but are in the air. There's a social democratic party that doesn't exist yet but which could come into existence. And then there's, an anti-social democratic party, a militant party that's for real revolution that doesn't yet exist but could come into existence.
What do you think about like just the opportunity cost here? I think we should mention that there's a huge opportunity cost. Left Voice is committed a vast amount of resources and time and effort into basically, exposing Bernie and discussing the campaign, not just exposing them, but also discussing the campaign that Bernie's made, and I would say appealing to Sanders supporters. And the way I see it is there's just a huge opportunity cost here that maybe they fail to recognize, or refuse to recognize.
Refuse is a better term than fail.
And
I think
it's important to point this opportunity cost out. For every article you write, or every word you write, there's a word you don't write, or there's an article you don't write. And I think that for a lot of people within the Marxist community, they haven't learned this lesson, this basic economic lesson yet. And it's with time economics, right?
Because it's a political lesson, really. I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. You obviously cannot do an infinite number of things. You have to decide what tasks are decisive. Some things are decisive and some things are not. So the need for an independent party that's independent of the Democrats is asserting itself, and it's being talked about all over. I mean, Ted Rall had the cartoonist, had a major article on the need for a third party, and it could come into existence. But the issue is that if you're conscious, you need to be focusing not simply on a third party, but on a party that's independent of social democracy, or a grouping that's independent of social democracy, other than your little cult. And so the opportunity argument is correct. Now, from their perspective, which is to recruit for their network, they're doing the right thing, because this is going to recruit for their network. But the problem is that just their whole history, the history of all these trot groups, they're tending to like stake out the left position within the social democratic milieu. And so, yeah, there is an opportunity cost, and it would be better if they could see with more clarity. I'm blabbering a bit.
Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that opportunity cost, because like I don't think that it's bad to expose Sanders or to explain what it is, what Sanders is, but how many articles are necessary to write about Sanders, right? As far as like how much time should we invest into that as revolutionaries? And I think that's important for people within the Marxist community to think about, like, because if every group writes 20 articles on Sanders and then doesn't write anything on, say, what's going to build a party, or how these networks are going to function, or what rules need to be put into place, how groups are going to be moderated,
And that's
then it amounts to nothing at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's hugely important, because you can already see people who are saying, well, let's just continue on with like the next generation of like AOC and stuff. And
Right.
I mean, unless that's laid out, they've got nowhere else to go. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, well, not everybody, but I mean, without that being laid down, I don't see a big clear break happening.
I don't
agree.
think the number of articles they're writing about Sanders is excessive for a group. I mean, it's one thing if the group was 3 people, but they have, I think, enough resources that, I'm assuming they have at least a dozen people that have the ability to write and spell, and to read news articles and so forth. So the number of articles they're writing seems to me completely appropriate. The problem is that they're not, they don't have any better vision than growing their network, their own walled garden.
So let's move on. So Socialist Resurgence, they have a newspaper for the spring of 2020.
So I think we mentioned it in a previous thing.
Yeah, we mentioned it last week, and I don't think any of us really did our homework on this. So we weren't really prepared to talk about it. But it's still the spring, so I think it's fine to talk about it still. And to be honest, even when the paper was released, I think it was a little bit dated as far as the content of the articles, because this is we're gonna have this new milestone of really when the coronavirus shit really hit the fan in March, and how it changed everything. But so I would say that most of the content is pre shit hit the fan instead of post shit hit the fan. It's 8 pages long, and let me pull up my notes on this here, because I did take some notes. And generally, what I find with most of these, I was talking to Andrew earlier, with most of these paper mill articles, because we cover a lot here in the show, and a lot of comrades probably want some tricks on how to read these fast or more rapidly. And one of my favorite tricks is just to like skim the article and get down to the last two
The
paragraphs.
payload.
And yeah, and if you when you skim the article, you'll find out rather quickly whether you need to read it more carefully or not. Uh, and you'll get to the last one or two paragraphs, usually the last paragraph, or yeah, and then if you can't find it there, you usually find it in the second to the last paragraph of like, well, what's the point of the article, or what's what's really is being written that other Marxists can digest other than say news reporting. And if you want to read the news reporting, you can of course read the body, uh, but uh, but basically, like here, a better way is possible. A workers' government can fairly distribute work, uh, and uh, and and provide asylum seekers justice. And with the article on climate change, if I can find it here. Uh, Here it is. Uh, the payload's a little bit earlier, I would say. Um, it's uh, it's basically who's the subject in the struggle. This is the climate change struggle, and it says the workerist industrialist dogmatism of the previous century is no longer current. That's kind of surprising to read that. Um, so that's basically suggesting that workers are not leading the climate change movement, or don't have a big role in it. Um, and instead it says the forces now at the forefront of the confrontation are youth, women, indigenous people, and peasants. Well, yes, I mean, I agree that, yes, youth, women, indigenous people, and peasants are at the forefront, but so they're not workers? There's no women workers involved in this, or indigenous workers, uh, or or youth workers, because many of the workers that I've come into contact with seem to be involved with this, whether they're women or native. Uh, and then another article, which is about the Middle East. Uh, Sorry, I'm going to go through these pretty fast because there's 8 pages long here, um, and then we can just talk about all of them at once. uh, so it says that the Middle East is basically ripe for a revolutionary situation. This is, of course, before the coronavirus hit. There were big protests in the Middle East, and it says that the U.S. working class has nothing to gain from carrying out wars, and that there's no better example of strikes and massive street demonstrations as far as how to fight the bosses. And really, the centerpiece article here is Socialist Resurgence Join Us, uh, where basically they summarize in about a paragraph what they think they are. Socialist Resurgence is a group of revolutionary Marxists dedicated to overthrowing this rotten system, and our organization provides space where you can learn skills and blah blah blah, and basically learn how to coordinate your organizing efforts. And We hope to make a meaningful contribution to the creation of a workers' party and an international movement. And then demands list, which we've talked about in previous shows, and no support for Dems, workers, government, and planned economy. And if you agree to all 12 points, or to our 12-point program, we want to help build a revolutionary movement. So you can join if you agree. Um, So the
Join
if
our
isn't
cult,
in there,
not
but
any other cult. We're the best cult. We're not a cult the way those other
yeah.
cults are cults.
Um, now, yeah, and I think this is definitely problematic here with this demands layout, and then if you agree to all these demands, because generally these groups within the Marxist community that are kind of cookie cutter like this, uh, they they set up the demands list and then they say, hey, if you like our demands, you should join, but you have to agree to all these demands. The problem is who they're recruiting. They're not recruiting other Marxists for one, and like Marxists of a different trends or trying to work with other Marxists when they have these kinds of recruitment articles or segments in their newspaper or their article. And the other problem is a lot of ordinary people, ordinary workers, will not agree to all these demands.
Yeah.
And the reason is because there's a huge section of backwardness within the working class. And a lot of the work of Marxists is actually convincing workers that a lot of these demands are necessary to fight for. So there's big problems there, both ways. Anyway, any comments?
No, I'm agree. We talked about this earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I looked at it a couple of weeks ago and didn't find anything in it particularly exciting.
So, so redfish. I'm not super familiar with redfish, but it's basically uh, a like I don't know why it's a fish, and so don't pick on me for this if anybody's watching this and knows the reason. Uh, so, so redfish is basically a kind of media collective, um, and so they shared this video that's kind of, I would say it's gone viral with people within the Marxist community, which is not viral by mainstream standards by any means, but it's widely shared. And so this is a video of a nurse, and she's also, I think she's a member of Left Voice, and she's talking about the conditions in her hospital and really in the U.S. healthcare system in general. Over the last 24 hours. And so this is being spread. Her name's Traquan. And I actually like the video a lot. I think it's worth sharing. She probably says more in this little video than a lot of socialists say in 10 articles. And
I like this though because I mean I've got nurse friends in the States too that aren't socialists and they're saying the same things too. So I mean they're starting to get they're getting it too. I mean they're understanding the like I mean this is such an important thing for that people are realizing. But it was a good video, and I liked how it connected to some of my other friends that weren't socialist before, but now they're starting to see, kind of starting to, the veil has been lifted on some of them.
Yeah, I think it's good to have media like this, and Traquan's also gotten herself into, I think it was like CBS or ABC, and another Left Voice member was put on maybe NBC. I think he's actually in this video, and I think she was also, someone correct me if I'm wrong, I think she was also interviewed by Democracy Now!, which I didn't see, so I can't comment on the interview. But it's good. I think it's good to promote this. I didn't have any criticisms really of it. I thought it was pretty well put together. And it's important for, I think, people within the Marxist community to have media that is presentable to like a wider audience. That's and we can actually be proud to share. Which, and the problem is that there's not much of it out there.
Yeah, because I mean, this is a good balance. It doesn't, get right in there and say overthrow the evil capitalists. It's just
And it
showing.
doesn't say like you need to join
Yeah,
Left Voice either.
it's just showing what's going on.
Right. Um, no, I thought it was pretty good. Um, yeah, hats off to Traquan for doing a good job there, in my opinion. Do you want to move on?
Yeah, it was a good video.
So,
I liked it too.
yeah, you can find it on Redfish. Anyway, it's watching.
Yeah, I went there. There were some other interesting things too, so it was good.
Yeah, and so Revolutionary Socialist Network, the RSN, they had a panel discussion. This was yesterday on Saturday. And so far they've uploaded most of these panels to YouTube. I don't know if they've done that with this one yet.
Yeah, last one that they did that I covered, it took a couple days, so I'm sure it'll be up there. But it might take a couple days if it's not up there yet. I haven't checked yet.
When it is up, could you guys post a link to Discord? Because this is a major thing. And
yeah, I mean, me and Art caught most of it yesterday, and we were engaging in some of the discussion.
Yeah, I was finishing up the letter to the Carpenter's letter, and to make that a petition type thing so other people could sign it. And I joined, I would say about 45 minutes in. Like, it was a little bit later than I wanted to, really. But when I joined, the topic of discussion was, and I kind of just butted in here, so I can't give a lot of context to what led up to this topic, but the topic of discussion was moving the unions to the left to take more radical action. And really this translates to union leaders. And so I got pretty lucky to join in when I did, because this is a common attitude within the Marxist community, that the union leaders need to be pushed to the left, that we can push them to the left and convince them to do things.
Raise their consciousness of the hacks.
Yeah, raise their consciousness. And so there's two different live streams. In the future, I think it's important to make sure you're on the Zoom. I think it's Zoom live stream, which is the original live stream, and the other live stream was Facebook. And so the Zoom live stream actually had the chat.
Yeah, way more. I forgot about that. I went on there and I thought, yeah, and there was a lot more people participating on that. And
right, and so the yeah, so we got on the chat. I got on rather late, and of course, and I opposed this idea of pushing the union leadership to the left. I wrote several paragraphs basically why I opposed it, and explaining my reasoning, and also giving a short intro who I was. And basically, I promoted the idea that we need to prepare to combat the union leadership and fight them, and that their interests are deeply aligned with the capitalist class, and also that it's likely the unions, there's another idea within the Marxist community, that the unions can be taken over. This is an old idea. It goes back about 100 years to the formation of the IWW and the old Socialist Party. But there's this idea that the unions can be taken over and turned into red unions, and I mean like the AFL-CIO, and so I think there's a serious possibility that this is no longer possible, and that this is basically idealism. So we would like to take over the unions, but the thing is, the unions today are not like the unions of 100 years ago. They're far larger. The bureaucracies are far more technical than they've ever been. And the bureaucrats are far more entrenched than they've ever been. And this is not a strategy that's ever been proven effective in the United States. And
It's
so
similar to
when I
moving the
mentioned,
Democratic Party to the left. It's just like good fucking luck. That's what they're trying to get you to do, to tire yourselves out so that you're useless. That's the whole design. I'm sorry, go ahead.
right.
Okay, yeah, sorry, Ben.
Uh-huh.
Or sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so anyway, I oppose this idea openly in the chat, and uh, the the panelists did see my comments, and so they felt obligated to respond. Uh, and I don't want to say exactly who said what as far as because I may be mistaken, but I know one of the panelists um, basically said he disagreed with me, that he thinks that the union leadership could certainly move to the left, clarifying that when he said the unions could be moved to the left, that he meant the union leadership. And so that was made more clear, which I'm actually glad that we got that out in the open. Blanca, this woman here, she had probably the best position, though I felt like it was incomplete and it was mistaken. Her position was that uh, union leadership is basically going to take action when workers independently start taking action. And so as far as union leaders taking action and doing the right thing or whatever, uh, we shouldn't waste our time on them, and instead we should be organizing with workers, and workers uh, should be should take action, and the union leaders are going to respond later. Uh, and So anyway, and also I want to mention Steve Lay from Seattle, who I know is a member of the RSN and the RSN chapter here in Seattle, which I think is it Revolutionary Socialists of Seattle? So Steve Lee responded to me and told me read Teamster Rebellion, about the 1934 Teamsters Rebellion.
That's called throwing
And
the
this
book
is
at someone.
right.
It's like you've made an
And
argument, I've made an argument, but this book is on my side. It's 300 pages. I'm going to throw it at you and just claim that it supports me, even if it actually supports you.
well, I think it's important for people within the Marxist community to be familiar with the Teamster Rebellion.
Yeah.
It was a significant event in 1934, and the Trots did lead it, like Pharrell Dobbs. Pharrell Dobbs later mentored Jimmy Hoffa, who was Jimmy Hoffa Sr., who was the most significant labor leader in the 20th century, in the later half of the 20th century. And so I think it's important to at least be knowledgeable about the 1934 Teamsters Rebellion. But the Teamsters Rebellion, and later I had a conversation with a comrade who liked what I had to say and brought up the Teamsters Rebellion as well. What about the Teamsters Rebellion? That's an example of the revolutionary leadership, or revolutionaries taking over the union leadership, and I had to explain to him That's totally false. That's not true at all. And it's important to understand the facts of the history when we talk about these things. So Steve Lee wants to throw out Teamsters Rebellion at me, but I'm familiar with the Teamsters Rebellion. The Trots never took over the Teamsters. They took over a local, which is very different. So the Minneapolis local, they built support to take it over, but they never took over the whole Teamsters Union. And yeah, they gained influence from that local, but the whole local was expelled. The entire local was expelled, and it was rebuilt by the union leadership at the Teamsters as a completely separate local. And I did mention, if there is a labor struggle that's really worth studying in as far as like the role that revolutionaries can play within a union, it's and while I think it's the ILWU, the Longshoremen struggle on the West Coast, and that was when members of the Communist Party began to agitate with the longshore workers, who were a blue book union, a company union, and they agitated those workers independently. This is before they had a formal union leadership. They organized mass conferences all up and down the West Coast by those workers. Now, there was a strong worker sentiment to want to join the ILA, that's the International Longshoremen Association, which is the longshore union on the East Coast that was at that time already considered corrupt by communists. And so the longshore workers in the West Coast wanted to join the ILA because that was a union. That was considered a real union. And the communists, which was basically led by Harry Bridges, opposed joining the ILA, knowing that it's corrupt. But it was the popular will, and they supported the democratic will of the workers, and so the workers, they're organized under the ILA. And meanwhile, the communists the whole time ran a newspaper called or a newsletter called the Waterfront Worker. It's a very famous newsletter that's documented by the University of Washington. And so then, after the West Coast workers joined the ILA, the communists within the ILA on the West Coast, not only did they agitate against the port contractors, or the port owners, but they also agitated against the ILA bureaucrats and their relationship with the port owners. And they advocated forming a new independent union, basically to continue having worker conferences. And eventually what happened was these worker conferences voted to break from the ILA after the corruption became so apparent, and they formed the ILWU. And that's probably the closest thing ever in the United States that we've seen basically a coup against the labor bureaucrats, like ever in U.S. history that I have ever seen in reading about U.S. history. That's the closest thing. And I'm not even sure if it's possible today, but the model is that you can't push the labor bureaucrats to the left. You have to fight them and expose the shit out of them.
Correct.
Anyway, moving on. Weekly Worker. They have this article on. It's on what's going to be different from the coronavirus.
Is that on the list? Because I don't know if I've seen it.
me check.
Yeah.
Yes, what will be the long-term consequences of the current crisis?
So when I looked at
I
it, it
think
looked
it's
like it was a video, not something to read.
oh
Am I mistaken?
I've got an article, so I don't know what the video was, but I've got an
All
article on
right.
that.
Let me take a look. See what happened here.
I did reorganize this this morning, so it might be on a different order.
So I'm looking at an article. I'll look at it now while you describe it.
Sure. So this article is one of the better COVID articles I've seen. And I think it's important and good to talk about just what are the changes that we can expect, even if we're not totally certain on what those changes are. But it's important to start thinking about it. We're going to be in a new political environment, and I think it's important for the Marxist community to rapidly adapt to what's going on and to think about what's going on, how it's going to affect our work, how it's going to affect the working class. And I know, like, the three of us have had these conversations in the past, how things are going to be very different. And I would say that that's basically the summary of the article. It mentions how the nurses are helping to lead the workers' struggle, and the nurses are majority women. And so it does mention that. It mentions some talks about the general strikes, including Amazon. And it mentions that there's these groups that are kind of forming, that are kind of petty bourgeois groups. It mentions specifically this group called the Macquarie Group, which is the world's biggest manager of infrastructure, and how conventional capitalism is dying or mutating in something that's closer to a version of communism. And it mentions very specifically, this will not be like a moneyless, stateless vision that inspires genuine Marxists.
It's more like the
Rather, it's going
state
to be
capitalism.
right. And this is basically something that's being mentioned amongst the bourgeoisie. And it also mentions Mike Davis and some of his thoughts. Mike Davis is being shared with, I'd say that he's kind of a academic Marxist thinker that gets shared around with in the Marxist community here in the United States. But anyway, it's good to be thinking about these things, and hopefully we'll continue thinking about these things, how the virus is going to affect everything, and how we need to respond and build strategy around that, or revise strategy around that. And so that's that. You guys want to move on?
Yeah.
Sure.
This.
So
Yeah, we've covered this one, right?
No, we haven't. This is the CPI India.
Oh no! Oh,
So,
okay. Because this one is.
Or Communist Party of
Oh
India.
wait!
So
Oh wait!
CPI.
No! Because we. Yeah. I see what's happening here.
Yeah. So this is CPIML, and so I had a talk with an Indian comrade on Facebook, and he was curious that I was critical of China, and so I basically, just to pick at his curiosity, I asked him, so basically why, why so curious? And he said that basically most people that he's encountered within India on the left, most within the Marxist community in India, have illusions in China, and they're promoting illusions in China that basically it's kicking ass with the virus, and so he seemed pretty disheartened by that. And so I asked him for some articles. He gave me some articles by one of the other. He gave me 3 articles by a different Indian Communist Party that did seem to have some illusions in China that didn't have any criticisms. And he told me that if I wanted to learn more, I should speak to one of his comrades, who I asked, hey, can you give me some articles or an article that helps to explain what comrades are thinking in India? And so he sent me the link to this. Now, India is a very big country in terms of population. It has what, like
1.2,
maybe 3 or
3
4
billion. Yeah, 1.3.
Will soon
Yeah.
be the most populous country in the world if it's not already.
Right. And so I think it's important to have a pulse on what's going on in there. And as far as the Marxist community, I think it's important not to dismiss the role that Indian Marxists have today and will have tomorrow on the whole community. Just by numbers alone. And the amount of influence they're going to have on the community. And so I took a look at this article. This was linked to me by Comrade Partha. And this is written, or at least it's signed by the General Secretary of CPIML. And it talks about the conditions in India, and basically this virus, when it hits India, it's going to ravage it. And for anybody that's spent any time taking a look at India and the conditions there, it should really be no surprise. Like, they're not prepared there to deal with the virus. It's not the same as China as far as the way the government is able to handle a crisis like this. And the Modi regime is incredibly backward. And there's also a lot of conspiracy theories and that kind of thing that's being promoted there. So this article basically says, prepare for some bad times ahead. And one thing that I thought was really interesting was its mention of a article by the journal Chuang. The article is called Social Contagion. And Chuang, I thought, was pretty little known in the Marxist community. And then I started to look at CPI's website, and I found another article and this is it. And it's called It's called China and the Coronavirus Pandemic Lessons for Communists. And what it is it's excerpts from the Chuang blog, the essay in the Chuang blog, Social Contagion. So excerpts from Social Contagion. And so one thing I thought was interesting was the CPIML, their general secretary, is reading Social Contagion. And so that's a pretty strong endorsement, in my opinion. And there's other links. So there's about 3 articles that link to Social Contagion in CPIML, which is one of the largest communist parties in the world. And probably one of the most influential. So, with that said, Social Contagion was recently translated into Chinese. And the background on Trung is that it's a, I'll find the English version here. The background is that the journal is by Chinese Marxists, and it's based on another Marxist journal that's called Endnotes.
Now, just
And as far
clarify,
as like,
when you say Chinese Marxists, you're not talking about so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics, but you're talking about people who are more serious about real Marxism.
right, and for lack of better description, I would say that their trend is probably a little bit more left communist. But that's a very vague descriptor, and I'm aware of that.
But the point is, it isn't
But
a pro-government flunky.
right. So Social Contagion was recently translated into Chinese. The English version came out first. We covered it, and basically, it's a pretty in-depth summary of the coronavirus in China, the conditions, not only the technical aspects of how it developed. It doesn't go too deep into like the biology as a zoonotical disease from bats and to the meat, the wet market in Wuhan, but it goes into a lot of the conditions within China, the economic conditions that help to exacerbate the problem. And I thought that was pretty important to talk about. It's important for a lot of members or people within the Marxist community to recognize. And when I read this, I don't think that it promoted illusions in China. And so I think that my Indian friend was actually mistaken. That this is that this is the dominant view that China can do no wrong, basically. Because Social Contagion is almost a condemnation of China and its role in basically building up the forces of the virus, and also it goes into how it contained the virus as well, its initial reaction as well as how it contained the virus. Anyway, it's a very mature article on that in that respect, and it doesn't get into a lot of rhetoric, which is good. If anybody hasn't taken a look at it, I think it's worth taking a look at. And I think given the CPIML's endorsement of it by their general secretary, it's definitely becoming. I mean, I think it's safe to say that it's an influential article within the community, and it's starting to really carry its weight.
I will take a look at it.
Yeah. So
what I usually do, by the way, with lengthy articles is I'll make a PDF and then I'll print out like the first 3 or 4 pages and the last 3 or 4 pages. And if they're good, then I can look at the whole thing.
Yeah. And so, lastly,
this looks fairly good. It looks like it's intelligently written.
Yeah. So I just want to mention, moving on.
Yeah.
Is that Socialist Resurgence announced that it's going to have an April 16th webinar. So that's in 4 days on Thursday. And make sure the date and the time's correct. And so it's going to be at 7 p.m. Eastern.
So 4 p.m. right?
That would,
our time? Yeah.
Right. 4 p.m. Pacific. And it's going to be on China from worker state to imperialist power. And it's also going to be on Zoom. You will have to have the Zoom software and be registered to basically be in the chat. It will also be on Facebook, but you will not be able to see the chat on Facebook. So I think it's important to participate in the chat, or to be able to participate in the chat. And it would be good to hear like the perspective of the panelists on social contagion, I think. And also, it would also be good to read the background Socialist Resurgence's document, China, a New Imperialist Power, which is a very long document, by the way.
So Art, where do I find that? If I go to the webinar page, will it show up, that document?
So if you go to the link that's in the show notes.
I did. I'm just there right now.
And if you go to the bottom, there's a link to the document. And there's also the
okay,
Zoom
hang on.
link.
I'm on the page. Now go to the bottom of the.
Oh, that is long. That's like
It's
80 pages.
It's like 80 pages, I think.
70.
Yeah.
Oh, hold
so
on, 70.
all I
we
find
talked about
is,
this.
There's a link to another page that says documents, which lists several documents.
Yeah. So what they're referring to is. So when you go to the documents page and you scroll down a little bit.
China, a New Imperial Power from 2018 SA Convention.
Yeah, this is one of the documents that helped to get them kicked out of the Socialist Action.
Yeah, it's like 60
pages.
65. The rest are bibliography. So,
Now, just a heads up, I don't think it's a document you really have to read super carefully, but so I mean, I think you can probably get away with some skimming here.
Or you can print out the first 3 and then the last 3 pages and tells you if it's worth going into more.
Yeah, and just a summary, it basically is making the argument that China is an imperialist power. And on that subject, there's another book I've been looking at. I'll just promote it real quick since it's on my table here. It's called Is China an Imperialist Country? And it's by N.B. Turner.
It's not focusing.
But I can read it now.
Yeah. So anyway,
hold it further away. Hold it right in front of your face.
No.
Further
No,
away.
well, I think my camera it focuses on the face.
Oh.
As software that does that.
So hold it in the middle plane, so it's like in the exact same distance. There we go.
Oh, it almost was there.
It was there. It was in focus for a minute.
Okay,
It'll
do
it'll
that for
auto-
another 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Let's just do that.
Is China an imperialist country? It's by N.B. Turner, which is a Maoist perspective on China being an imperialist country, and it has a subtitle, Considerations and Evidence. You can probably find it on Amazon.
That reminds me. When are you going to give us your
My book report?
your book report on
I need to do that. I'm actually halfway through the Kissinger book. I was thinking I was going to go ahead and just read the rest of the Kissinger book. So I'm reading On China by Henry Kissinger. Ben's already read that. And then I was thinking I'd go ahead and read this, and then I'd probably give a big summary.
I tried to get you to read it when it first came out, I think.
Yeah, I think you did, and I never bought it. So
Then a couple of years later, you said, "Hey, have you read this book?"
I probably totally forgot about that.
It's an excellent book, by the way.
I was talking about your book report on Xi Jinping.
On Xi Jinping, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I thought you were gonna
I did finish the two books by Xi Jinping. Yeah, I'd say they're interesting, but they didn't make the case that China's a revolutionary government to me.
What? You spoiled the ending for me. I was gonna read it. No. Fuck. Okay.
Yeah. So
Thanks a lot.
They made a poor case. So yeah, that about concludes our show. So thanks for watching, everybody. We'll be back next week, 12 p.m. Pacific. And as always, you can drop something on the Reddit. We have a Facebook at TheMarxistLine, so it'd be. I'll put it in the chat here, real quick. So our Facebook is there. You might have to ask for an invite, but just ask for an invite, you'll get approved. And that's basically it. We're gonna have our show notes there. If we're missing any show notes, just feel free to poke at me on Reddit and tell me what I'm missing.
Do you want to post the Reddit link just quickly also for everybody?
Yeah. The Reddit is on our banner, and it's also at
just in case they.
And if there's anybody watching, it's useful just to say hi or something, so we know we're not just talking to ourselves. It's always good to know that there's actual human beings who are going with us on this journey.
Yeah, definitely follow and tell your friends and keep in touch. See you next week.
All right, thanks for joining us. See you next week.